And Zeev Haskal is next about how to work for a journal.
So I'm not sure that working for a journal in your first 5 years is necessarily a goal, but I'd give you a perspective that I had never any plans to go into academia. I never took an English course in college because I hated to write. I never wanted to write papers. So don't presuppose what you can or can't do. And I certainly had no goal of working in a journal in any capacity. These were simply novel opportunities. So your slate is as blank as any of the physicians who've been and leaders who've been talking here today. So first, why? Curiosity. You want to see pipeline research as a reviewer or as an editor. You read differently if you have to look at the skeleton of a paper and how it's constructed. And the same analysis process can be applied to an ophthalmology clinical paper as a clinical paper in IR or somewhere else. You come with a natural affinity for journalism or language. See it as a way for academic advancement at your institution. Working for a journal is certainly a path to editorial roles, and for JVR alone, our associate editors, many of them have come up from being our stellar reviewers, or you have a vision that you'd like to impact in a journal or other fashion, or perhaps start your own form of publishing. So research and editing, even if we're not going to be researchers, but we're going to be clinician educators, we need to be able to know how to interpret results for ourselves and for other people that we're teaching or educating. And that means that reviewing for a journal or participating in critical reading can be interesting and useful. As a worker for a journal, our goal also is to look for misconduct, for fabrication, for unethical principles. It certainly cannot be caught by the editors alone, and as a reviewer or subsequent reader, this kind of surveillance and policing is essential, and I can assure you that publishing misconduct absolutely continues. We run investigations every year, every journal editor. So practical steps for getting started are simply volunteering. Realize that every editor is more than happy, every good editor, I think, to see new reviewers and probably has mentoring programs. Volunteer, find a mentor to do reviews with you who will make sure that you're delivering good content for that journal, and you're also learning with that mentor how to do that critical reading. It's a mutual educational process. Just a few things on what a good reviewer does. Filter out incorrect, bad work, improve the accuracy and clarity of papers that will be published. Our job as reviewers is not to assassinate papers, but to elevate them and perhaps move them to the best that they can be. Look at the technical skills, the stylistic flaws in the paper, try to determine whether this is actually novel or adds incremental knowledge to an existing base as well. Make recommendations to the editors as to what the fate of this should be. Look at the scientific quality, which means doing some research about that research and the lay of the landscape as well. Did they present it with clarity? Was it ethically valid? Were the conclusions valid as well? And certainly look for things like duplication as well as other forms of misconduct or even frank fraud. What's a bad reviewer do? Assassinate the papers for sport because you're in a position of power by being the reviewer, or worse, not have the self-insight that Dr. Matsumoto described into realizing that you're assassinating, either because one may have their own biases in that area from their practice or their own dogma or their own research as well. Delay the review. There's a courtesy that should work both ways, the golden rule, which means review quickly. Same things that we'd like for our own papers as well. Manage and understand your own bias, which is a good rule as a researcher in any aspect as well. Breach the confidentiality of that paper. It's not public and it can't be released beyond the scope of the review process. Not acknowledge one's own conflict of interests in the review and reasons why there may or may not be unacknowledged bias. And also not realize that publication can allow for conflict. That papers can be early, they can be subject to conflict, they may be upended by subsequent comments and letters as well, and as long as it's methodologically valid, it may well belong in the literature and stir that conflict. Recall the history of H. pylori and that Nobel Prize that was decades of being dismissed. How could bacteria cause a gastric ulcer? Some examples, I think I'll quickly move past this one, but this was an example of a duplicate publication in which this author had essentially copied their prior paper elsewhere, even word for word, even the figures that are the same, and denied it despite the investigation, and continued to fall back upon things saying, well, I inadvertently pulled from the same pictures, to I didn't realize they were the same, to ultimately the same thing that every plagiarizer has said, which is this information is too important and it has to be disseminated in multiple places, and this is bigger than your journal. This is someone who doesn't understand their bias. So we look for these types of things, and as a reviewer you have to hunt for it because the editors of the journal will not necessarily catch it. Plagiarism is an interesting concept and sometimes foreign to reviewers and certainly to some authors, which is once your words are published, the publisher owns those sentences. They're no longer ours. So to repeat the exact same paragraph in another paper is a form of self-plagiarism. They can't write the exact same chapter multiple times. We used to think that we could do this. It's a bit of a higher risk in non-Western authors who may have had assistance in writing that first paper and will naturally gravitate to similar text. And depending on whether there's a real intent or it was inadvertent, we can try to correct that in the process before it becomes a larger issue. But keep your eyes open for it, and one of the ways to catch it is that there are some unusual or outstanding sentences compared to the style of the rest of the paper, and those might be flags. A quote that I keep in mind and thinking about when reading other people's papers: beyond the conscious faking of data lies the probably vast underworld of self-deception. The human tendency for an observer to see what he wants to see is far from rare in science. Most pernicious, or more pernicious even than the observer effects, is the unintentional bias in interpreting data, particularly when the scientist has personal preference to the outcome. It's a reason why we have limitations paragraphs, and it's the area of most resistance by authors who won't acknowledge, perhaps because they don't see the limitations. And the problem with that is that you don't see the next steps that your research can take by not acknowledging its current limitations. The other side in endovascular by the famous Tom Fogarty, which is no conflict, no interest, no innovation. So we need to balance both. Conflict of interest has different roles and different risks. Certainly this has become a national problem. Even congressmen and senators have talked about this. We know about the issues of the Sunshine Act, but even beforehand as well. Physicians may have to be different than the researchers in clinical trials, physician-to-patient relationships, the author of the paper as well. Physician as inventor may be a conflict, and incentivized researchers. So things that we have to judge when being the people who review the papers on behalf of a journal. What does it mean to radiology? We're not making heart valves. Does it really make a difference? Our stakes are smaller. Not really. Think about the types of technologies that come back every 6 or 7 years, recycled in another variation that get a lot of national press, the latest version of the PAD device that is going to solve a problem that may be an advance, or it may be a commercial recycling for a new generation. So we have a duty to try to understand what the conflicts are and try to see what the science and the data is underneath it all. It's equally important in interventional radiology. Ethical components of research are things to keep in mind in working for a journal. Was it ethically undertaken? Should this have been done for those patients, and do we think that they were informed actually sufficiently to have participated in this? Does it have scientific merit and social value to have conducted this research and exposed people to whatever incremental risks? Were they informed? Were their medical records and health information kept confidential? Were the conflict of interest of the physicians disclosed to the patients as well? Did they report all their data, or did they hide the negative data? And of course, negative data has to be published as well. We've learned that from the pharma industry as well. And there should be opportunities for whistleblowing as well. IRB approval applies to any research that gets published, certainly in our journal. It has to either be released from IRB approval, or there has to be IRB approval. And ideally, it should not be the classic IR paper in which we did this and then we went back to the IRB and said, we'd like to talk about what we did. That is, the standard but lazy approach, because we've exposed patients to risks for new treatment rather than having done the front-end work, and frankly that does mark down the value from retrospective to prospective. So plan for these things both as researchers and look for them as people who work for a journal. Research misconduct is an important thing. Fabrication of data, reviewing research, plagiarism is important. And be careful as yourselves of unwitting authorship. Also as reviewers, it is no gift to be on top of another paper, particularly when you may be party to unrecognized fabrication. There doesn't need to be 11 authors on a report of one case. What's the downside? This famous one that you can look up on your own of Dr. Slutsky, who took down an entire group of physicians and researchers by padding their resumes as co-authors. There are many smaller examples of this. So in conclusion, vigilance, awareness, skepticism, rigor, humility, need them for all levels, as people who work for a journal, as readers, as grantees, as mentors, as colleagues. Journal work is very interesting and very satisfying, and you've got interest, come and grab me afterwards.